Sound, music, sustainability. Welcome to Sustain FM. Welcome to the first episode of Sustain, Harmonizing Sound and Sustainability. I'm very excited to launch this radio show and happy to be here with you today. I'm your host, Steve Williams, taking us through conversations, ideas, and sounds that connect music and sustainability together. And this really brings together two parts of my life. In one part, I'm a sustainability researcher based in Berlin and looking at how energy systems change in Canada, Germany, and Sweden, looking more at the social, culture, and political parts of change, not the tech so much. And the other part of my life is as a sound artist and live techno performer is Drew's Noise. And I love bringing the two worlds together and exploring how sound and music, sustainability, electronic music fit together in different ways. And that connection even shows up in my artist name, which came from my niece and nephew. And when I was doing my PhD, they started calling me Dr. Uncle Steve. So I took the DRUS, added some noise, and ended up with Drew's Noise. So trying to pull all that together, the idea behind this show is to highlight and talk with artists, researchers, sustainability folks, activists, and all those who are working with sound and music and sustainability to share ideas, share artists, share sounds, and really learn together about how we can use the power of music and sound to really help with our sustainability challenges that we face in the world today. So let's get into it. So in this episode, we dig into how sound and music can fit together with sustainability transitions, really looking at how we can change whole parts of our society to become more sustainable, not just putting more solar panels on roofs or doing more recycling, but really how do we change the systems and structures of our society to become more just, more open, more inclusive, more sustainable in many different ways. And earlier this year, I had the chance to compose and perform with some colleagues to open the International Sustainability Transitions Conference in Utrecht in the Netherlands. And this is an academic conference that typically tend to be quite dry, people looking at different aspects of sustainability. So we really had the chance to bring in music and sound. I also played a live sustainable techno set at the conference party and performed a sound art composition based on turning climate data into sound to close the conference. It was quite the week, and we had a lot of fun bringing sustainability to life through music in a few different ways. And in this episode, we're really going to explore that opening performance, where I was collaborating with a few different people. So let's get started with Josie Chambers and Dan Lockton. All right, so great. I'm happy to be here with Josie Chambers from Utrecht University and Dan Lockton from Eindhoven University of Technology. Thanks very much for joining and taking the time. And I guess before we jump in, maybe you could each just introduce yourselves, maybe starting with how did you actually end up in the Netherlands, and maybe also what gets you excited these days?
Oh, yeah, great. Thanks so much for the invitation, Steve. It's really nice to join. So I currently work at the Urban Future Studio at Utrecht University, and I've been there for about a year and a half now. And it's a really fascinating space to be surrounded by people who are really interested in how social science, transdisciplinary work, creative and artistic practice, and imagining the future, how all of these things come together in one space to really push the boundaries of our imagination.
That's a pretty cool combination. That's pretty amazing. Great. And yourself, Dan?
And yeah, I'm Dan Lockton. I'm an assistant professor at Eindhoven University of Technology in the Department of Industrial Design. And I've been here, I've been in this job 2.5 years. I suppose I'm excited by how we can use creative methods. So I've come at this as a designer originally, how we can use creative methods to investigate and kind of reimagine different ways of thinking about sustainability and futures and these kinds of things. So so I sort of see music as being a slightly adjunct to my kind of normal practice in that way. But I'm really interested to see the creative possibilities for in this space.
Okay, very cool. Very cool. Well, that's okay. I can imagine about a 4-hour interview with both of you. So I'll try and keep it a little bit shorter than that. To you, Dan, because you're in your introduction, you were talking about design and creativity and problem solving. And that's kind of interesting background of both design and imaginaries and interest in sound and music as well. So I'm curious, how are you bringing those pieces together?
Well, I think the way that it's often come about for me, or the way that I've sort of come to realize so I've done some work in the past on sonification, which is this approach of taking data and turning it into sound in some way. and particularly I've worked on sonifying energy use in different ways. But I became more interested, I think, in the sort of almost metaphorical aspects of it. So the easiest way to do it is just to translate some quantity, maybe it's watts or kilowatts or kilowatt hours perhaps, into a particular pitch or particular tone, and then say this represents that. But I became more interested in the metaphorical aspect. So are there different processes that perhaps can be translated into sound through metaphors? So one of the projects, for example, in the past that I worked on used bird song as metaphor, different types of birds as metaphors for different types of electrical appliances in terms of the energy they used, or have done a bit of work on things like using vibration as a way to try to bring the sort of wave pattern aspect of electricity into something that is more sort of physically engageable with in a way. So I guess I'm kind of interested in metaphors. I think they're one of the ways that we often and so it could be things like the woodpecker or the hero or these kinds of concepts, but we often use metaphors to make invisible phenomena understandable, or things that are abstract but turn them into something that we can kind of engage with. And I think there's a lot of that in music, and I'm that's partly what I'm interested in exploring the possibilities of in relation to sustainability, transitions, transformations, these kinds of things.
Interesting. And do you mentioned that there's a lot of that in music? I mean, is there something in particular about music that's really appealing to be using for that metaphor? Because I imagine you could also, people do use metaphors in writing and painting and theater and in different art forms. I'm curious, what is it about music that's kind of attractive to use it with the metaphors?
Well, I think, the designer in me says in a very sort of, pragmatic way that music is something, and sound in general are things that we can have our attention. We can use our attention in different ways. We can have things that are in the background, which we are peripherally paying attention to, rather than having to look at it all the time. And so I think there's a lot of potential in musical metaphors as being things that become part of our kind of experience of the world, in a way where reading something or looking at a screen is something where your attention is consciously directed towards it. And I think I don't know, I feel there's a lot of potential for music as this in an ambient way, or in a kind of peripheral sense, to increase our kind of understanding or change perhaps our perceptions of the world.
Interesting. So changing perceptions, that's actually an interesting maybe segue, because one of the things I want to dig into, Josie, is it's only a few weeks ago, actually, that we were in Utrecht performing a piece to open the International Sustainability Transitions Conference. And I really want to talk a little bit about that in some more detail. And we'll be talking a little bit later on to Noor as well, who was an integral part of putting that performance together. But maybe can you talk a little bit about the idea behind the performance? It does seem a little strange to open a sustainability conference with a musical performance. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, what was behind that? How did that come about? How did that actually happen?
Yeah, so I think the idea was really to, so often in academic spaces, we start with the rational and we kind of have this emotional vacuum where we become way too serious about issues that are going on in the world. And that's not to say that these issues are not really serious, but I think when we think about our collective agency to actually really kind of feel the importance of taking action and opening up our imagination for what we can do, our emotions are so important and so central to that. And so I think our idea was really to foreground emotions, both in terms of the feeling of the music, but also even bringing some of these words from different abstracts, different emotions that kind of popped up a little bit on the margins, but really making that a bit more central, so that we can engage more directly with that at the start of the conference and hopefully set a different space by which then we continue to engage with each other.
Interesting. And Jan was just talking about the power of music and metaphor a moment ago. Do you see a connection there between how Dan was talking about metaphor and what we were just talking about there around bringing in feelings and using the words in the abstract?
Yeah, I'm definitely really interested in the power of music as metaphor. I think also, though, I'm interested in how it has this sort of ambiguous power whereby people feel more connected to each other, and kind of this emotional resonance can emerge in the room. I think there were several moments throughout our performance, either where people shared laughter or they shared discomfort, or they shared kind of hopefully kind of this sense of maybe serenity at certain moments. And I think that can be such a powerful kind of ambiguous binder, where it's not so much about telling people exactly what to think or explaining a certain rational concept, but connecting people together in the room over their emotions as a way to then open up how people are engaging with other things that are entering into the music.
Interesting. Okay, so yeah, it's really fascinating hearing this conversation. And obviously, when we were planning it, we put a lot of time into thinking about how to translate and sort of build some of those metaphors and translate those into different themes, expressions, and movements. So I thought, to give people a better idea what was going on, I'm going to play a couple of excerpts, and then maybe you can talk a little bit about what was actually happening and what we were trying to get across, and see how those fit together. So first of all, Josie, was that you screaming at the end there?
No, that was definitely not me screaming. I'm afraid I don't. Okay. I don't have that.
Okay. That's a pretty power scream there. Yeah, we'll talk to Joost about how and why that scream came to be. But so we just heard a couple of clips from that performance. But can you share a little bit about what you were? I think maybe from the both technically what was happening, but also coming back to this idea of metaphor of what were some of the ideas that you were trying to sort of translate through how you're performing and out into the audience?
I would say that we had kind of three very loose ideas guiding the way that we structured the piece, in the sense that in the first part around this word of doom, it was really about how we can sometimes flatten our expectations of how we think about the future. And by already kind of predicting the ending or getting the audience to clap or to boo or to be awkward at the end, almost then hopefully something more complex emerged from that in practice, as opposed to kind of only ending up with that flattened expectation. And really kind of, as we try to kind of reverse this doom, this enjoying of the doom, into really kind of listening to our collective mood. And I think that's where the second movement really engages with more emotional feeling, more emotional words, and also kind of the discomfort that comes with that, and that ultimately builds up to Joost's scream. And I also really enjoyed our making of the third movement, to kind of then, what do we do with that discomfort? Do we shut down, refuse to engage, or do we actually try to kind of embrace it and go along with it in kind of unexpected ways? And that's where I really also loved just all of the sounds that the diverse sounds that you brought in, Steve, to really kind of build more of a plurality of expression in that final part.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, and we'll play a little clip from that ending part later when the beats came in. But yeah, it was pretty cool to be playing with the samples and the drums and the vocals and Nora's bass and the scream and the audience sounds as well. But we've talked a lot so far about the metaphors and so what we were trying to get across. So I'm curious what you thought the audience got out of it compared to the expectations, because this was something that was the very first thing that opened the conference. So there was no introduction, there was no nothing. The lights kind of came down and we started to play. And then we had another 3 days. And with this academic community and sustainability transitions, generally pretty open to public engagement and innovations and new ideas and so on. But it's still a pretty traditional academic conference with student poster presentations and postdocs and professors presenting their research papers and those kind of things. So I'm curious, what was your experience kind of maybe right after the performance, and then any sort of sprinkling of feedback that you got through the next couple of days?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's hard to predict exactly how everyone in the audience, and I suppose I hope that it provoked very different kinds of emotions and thoughts in different people. It was interesting watching the faces of the audience during the performance, because I think there were definitely, I could pick up on certain moments of laughter, on certain moments of discomfort, certain enjoyment of different parts. So I kind of appreciated that plurality, even of emotions, that was hopefully within the audience throughout the entire performance. And I hope that first and foremost, it allowed people to pay attention more to their feelings. I think as Noor asked 3 times throughout, kind of in a deeper way each time, how are we feeling? I hope that it went from maybe a more kind of superficial, how are we feeling, that you get at conferences, into a more kind of deeper way of framing and really feeling that question. And I got from participants afterwards that I think, different elements kind of were left with people. I think also related to the language that we used. Some people kind of really appreciated hearing words that were in their abstract that weren't so present across all of the abstracts. So it might have also been a kind of a nice form of validation too for people who were engaging a bit more directly in more uncomfortable words or more emotional words or more dreamlike words like zeppelins. That we could have done that with the dominant words that appeared thousands of times. We could have had an encore refrain that sang about sustainability, transitions. But I just think maybe that's a bit more boring for people because they're kind of, it's just like looking in the mirror. You're just seeing what you always see. And if we're really talking seriously about how we're going to transform and transition into a very different type of world, I think we really have to confront ourselves with what we don't easily see. And try to look at more so maybe what's in the margins and what we need to bring in to create kind of new kinds of spaces.
So I'm curious for you both, what's next for sound and music and sustainability coming together? And I guess I'm asking that from kind of 2 different levels on where do you think the potentials are for sound, music, and sustainability for the field, for the discipline, for the researchers, for transition. But I'm also very curious about for you two as individuals, what's next? Really excited to hear sort of, your thoughts on kind of both of those levels.
I think for me, I'm especially interested in how, we've seen a lot of music as an exclamation point to try to make a particular point, either with very, very strong kind of environmental lyrics or part of a protest march where music emerges. And we've maybe seen a lot of more kind of music as a question mark that is quite ambiguous and open in its interpretation. And I'm really curious about that middle ground that lies in between, where music can open up our thinking towards certain questions and foster that connection between people to want to feel and explore that together. But then how that can also enable certain forms of politics and social spaces that really matter for transformation. And I think that's not easy to do from our experiments so far. It's very difficult to decide how much ambiguity you want to maintain, how much engagement with politics. So it's this incredibly difficult middle space, but really fruitful, I think. And I'm really excited to explore that more also with both of you.
That's great.
Yeah. For me, there was something that sort of came up, which maybe I had thought about before, but had never really articulated, which was that the often in working with metaphors or in ways to try to sort of help people imagine, I don't know, abstract concepts or things that are difficult to put into words, we often use metaphors in terms of images, but actually using clips of sound or music which represent or which can be sort of used to express particular types of, in this case, transition, for example. Like, we often think of transitions as being quite smooth, or they're often presented in that way in the kind of, abstract visualizations in transition studies. But in reality, the reality of transitions for people's lives are something where it's much more like the kind of waveform that might actually sound like something. It might actually it has peaks and troughs, and it has periods that are very compressed and periods that are very loud and periods that are very sharp changes and periods that are more about recovering something or going back to something. And I'm really interested by whether there are ways to produce almost quite simple sound clips that enable people to imagine or sort of represent different aspects of transition, moments of grief or moments of elation or moments of retreat or kind of trying something new or giving something up. And I think there's actually something quite powerful there of almost like using sound as a sort of pattern language for moments of transition or types of transition. So I'm interested to explore that.
Wow. Yeah. Both of those directions sound. I love that. Yeah. That idea of music as a question mark and the space in the middle, and that pattern language. Yeah. Both of those would be fascinating to explore. Wow. Okay. All right. I can't wait to literally hear. I was going to say I can't wait to see what happens next, but I'm going to rephrase that to hear what happens next. So, thank you, Josie and Dan, very much for your time, and can't wait to connect with you again soon.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve.
Thank you.
All right, welcome back. And now I have happy to have Joost Vervoort, who is one of the crew that put on our performance at the Sustainability Transitions Conference that Josie and Dan were talking about. And Joost is Associate Professor of Foresight and Anticipatory Governance in the Environmental Governance Group at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development. Whew, that's a mouthful to say all in one breath. And we're part of the performance. But Joost, that's not all of what you do. Can you tell us a little bit about the other part of your musical life and your band and how those fit together?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. Yeah. So I'm in a black metal band called Terzijde Horde. It's a Utrecht-based black metal band, part of a very lively sort of progressive-leaning black metal scene in Utrecht. And this band has been around for many years, from around 2010, actually. But in the last, I don't know, I guess last couple of years, really, but especially since last year, I would say things have really picked up for us. We had a new album come out called "In One of These I Am Your Enemy," and that was really received very well. And we played some really interesting festivals also outside of the metal scene. Really interesting collaborations have come up. So yeah, it's been an exciting time. Done some touring in Europe this summer, and it's very much a second life next to academia for sure.
That's very cool. And you say it's a second life next to academia, but there are some overlaps. I mean, I know you're interested in studying sustainability in different ways, and there's some of those pieces with your band. So I'm curious, how did those worlds come together? Like were they separate worlds, your sustainability and research side and music? And did they kind of merge at some point, or have they always been together in your mind? Or I'm curious about that.
That's a really good question. I think there was always a lot of research influence in the band. So I, together with the basis of the band, write the lyrics, and we have a lot of overlap in interests. He's also an academic and a teacher, and we use a lot of the same sources, some of the most interesting sort of literary sources or academic sources that I am inspired by in my work, and that Johan the bassist is inspired by in our lyrics. So I would say the interaction from academia to the band has been there for a long time, and also in interviews and things like that, things come up, so that framing has definitely been there. But in recent years, I used to work a lot on foresight and futures work, more policy related, and there wasn't really a lot of space for the reverse dynamic, I think. But in recent years, I've moved more to understanding cultural change and cultural imagination and how that relates to how people think about the future and what action can be taken in the present. And that includes, I do a lot of work on game design, but I was also involved in a big project called Creatures, which ended last year, which focused on a broader creative practice. And then I'm interested in music, more and more in music, together in conversation with you, Steve, and with Josie and Dan and others, as a transformational force. And I think it's very valuable to engage with music in this way, to think about the links between music and transformation. And having developed that thinking more also through the Creatures project, I started to look at my own band and the activities of the of that community more and more through that perspective as well. So to understand really what is happening, why would this music and this band and this sort of community be of relevance, and how can we explain that?
Okay, interesting. So that connection going back both ways is probably a good segue into talking a little bit about the IST performance. So I'm going to play you back a little clip here of the performance and then ask you about it. So that was quite the scream. Can you tell us what was happening there? What was why the scream? Why then? How did that kind of fit into the overall idea of the performance?
Yeah. So as we started to together discuss this performance and the first conceptualization conversations about it, there was a real desire to not just do a nice, neat, very sort of organized little song about sustainability at a conference in 2023 when things are very serious.
Mm-hmm. And I think we called that sustainability conference music.
That's right, sustainability conference music, right? So so there's lots of, and it's not just music. There's lots of art at sustainability conferences that is like, and I mean it's changing now, but I think in the past it was definitely like that, where it would be sort of like, sort of aesthetically pleasing art or music, but very elite and very sort of distant in some ways and very conceptual, Mm-hmm. And so what we discussed is that we wanted to do something different that was a bit more real than that, and maybe sort of shake up things a bit more. So my involvement was partly as the heartbeat, which became the beat of the song through your sort of a process, Steve, and then the scream was really meant to sort of like be this primal outcry, I suppose, of pain and rage and fear and sadness, just shaking up the frame of the song, sort of explicitly that way.
Interesting. Because when I talked to Dan and Josie earlier, she was talking a lot about the power of feeling. And when she wrote those lyrics of the piece of using the words that were not appearing in the conference abstracts, I think some of those words were feeling, pain, anger, fear, some of the things you mentioned, but none of those words actually appeared in any of the abstracts at a conference about sustainability transitions in the future. So it's an interesting way to bring that back into the piece.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So it was really, so Josie's lyrics already built up to this, I think. And then it sort of like exploded with that scream as something that's desperately, space is needed for this. We also see this with our students. Our students also really want the space to deal with difficult emotions around sustainability issues. So we are all looking for this, for different ways of expressing this, I think.
So it's interesting you mentioned the students, because you talked about your band earlier and about some of the things you were trying to do with the lyrics. But I know if we think about community, so students are a community, people in the audience, the sustainability conference are a community, the black metal scene is a community. And I know you and the band have been thinking a lot about what is the role of community and ritual and power and politics in those areas. Can you talk a little bit about how your band has been approaching that, and I guess specifically in the context of the black metal scene, because I know you've been thinking quite deeply about that.
Yeah, definitely. So So black metal has a kind of an extreme history as a genre. It was at some point, it has sort of diverse roots from all around the world, but at some point there was a sort of like more focused movement, you could say, from primarily Norway, and to basically make it much more of an ideological movement. So you make metal more of an ideological thing, or at least black metal, because there was this sense, I guess, that metal could be musically extreme, but people were just normal people, and this was considered to be a problem.
Right, normal people are a problem. Okay, right.
Yeah. It's not good. You have to be completely dedicated to the darkness, and that's quite it. That is interesting, of course, but lots of extremist ideas came out of this at some point. Lots of real physical violence came out of it, and at some point it turned sort of like a reasonable substream of black metal turned into essentially National Socialist black metal and this kind of stuff, which isn't great. And there's always the joke with black metal is always, you find a band that you really like, you got to do quite extensive Googling to make sure that they don't have any links to Nazi bands or Nazi projects or are themselves Nazis, which is not ideal, right? And it's interesting because black metal is as a genre, like that sort of ideological and almost religious mythical impulse that sort of push the genre in a new direction. The music that these people made who sort of tried to do that definitely has that spirit. So when you go to a great black metal show, it really feels like you're being inundated in a kind of hypnotic trance or ritual in a way that maybe previous types of metal, especially death metal at the time when black metal came up, was very sort of streamlined and sort of big. There was Cannibal Corpse was an Ace Ventura in the movie and stuff like that, right? So there is something really potentially at least profoundly mystical about black metal. That's the aesthetic ideal, you could say. And to be able to take that ritual experience where there's this shared sense of focus and emotional energy around the music, and there's this a framing of sort of a mythical framing around it, to take that and to instead of that being something that's conservative, that's connected to sort of soil and blood kind of rhetoric, but to take it into a different political direction that is arguably more progressive or leftist, has been sort of great to see. There's quite a lot of bands doing that now, and in Utrecht there's a lot of bands like that, because the power of the ritual, this sort of mystical unity. It has a lot of nature qualities to it. It's very sort of this sense of oneness with nature. There's a strong romantic component to black metal, which can also be critiqued because the romanticism, the idea of one person connecting with nature, has problems, of course, but it's there. And to be able to take that basic experience, I've played black metal to people who have never heard it before, and they will say it sounds like being in a wintry forest. And I think that's quite powerful that can be expressed by music without sort of like explaining that, right? But taking that experience and putting it in a different political context has been quite powerful. And then you get a community of people around it who, it's not like politics are the focus in that scene, but they are connecting with each other. They're becoming friends. Their new relationships are starting in that world. And I think that's a powerful, if sort of like very distributed effect of this kind of music.
Yeah, that I find that fascinating because, as we've talked about before, I mean, there's many different ways that the arts and music and sustainability can connect. Everything from, making clubs and the venues that you play more green, reducing the trash that's at events, and of course that's important. And telling sustainability stories through music, of course, that can be important as well. But I think what you're talking about really is a bit of a different way of living, a different way of seeing the world, a different way of engaging the world, a different way of engaging with people. And I'm curious of the different directions that you see how sound and music and sustainability could fit together in the future. Is that where you see sort of the most promise, this idea of community and connection and power and politics, or is it related to some other direction that's maybe connected somehow?
So there's I'm rereading this book that I'm reading for a PhD student's work together with Josie, and it's called Utopia as Method by Ruth Levitas. And in Utopia's Method, there's a chapter about music and the utopian character of music, which is quite interesting. It's this idea that music is the most utopian of all art forms because it's able to express things non-verbally, of course, also verbally, but non-verbally, it expresses a sense of wanting more and a desire for things to be otherwise. That's very fundamental. And so in that way, music is really able to sort of like push the boundaries of what we want from reality, right? And that's music as a art form itself. But that, of course, is very difficult to measure.
Right.
It's really cool, and of course it can be researched, right? But I think the parts of it that are about people finding each other, making communities, being exposed to different ideas, to different groups, that's much easier to track. So I think all these things. So the Creatures Project, and this is something we've also written about together, Steve, right? For one of the scientific conferences that we're engaging with, and with the IST, where the screen was being done and the song was being performed. Is the Creatures framework that we use has sort of this model for thinking about creative practice and change, and there's changing meanings, changing connections, and changing power. That's sort of the model. So, and then there's subcategories in that, but basically the changing meanings, I think, has to do with this sort of utopian potential. So the music itself has sort of this inherent sense of more could be possible, and then of course the lyrics frame that, and then music is very mobile, right? It can be everywhere. People can hear music everywhere. They can take it along with them everywhere. So it can have a sort of influence on societal imaginaries in this very agile sense. And then in terms of changing connections, I think it's really about the building of communities and people sort of drawing together around music. And then in terms of changing power, then it really becomes a question of whose voices are being heard, who is able to sort of generate momentum in society around certain issues because of the music, and which kinds of systems are being subverted. So yeah.
Right. Excellent. Great. Thanks very much. Thanks for taking the time. And I can't wait to hear what comes next.
Thank you so much for the chat. Yeah.
Hi, Noor, and welcome. So before we dive in, can you tell people a little bit about yourself, maybe to start where you are and what's filling your days these days, or what's filling your nights, if you want to talk about that too?
Sure. Hi, Steve. So my name is Noor. I work in the field of environmental policy with a focus on nature and how nature contributes to people's lives. And I'm also a musician. I came to the field of environment, sustainability, and nature through music about 10, 11, 12 about 12 years ago. And so both of those things are a part of my life, often daily, where during the day I'm at the office, like here, and in the evenings I'm making music with friends, colleagues, band members, which is where I'm going to be in about 30 minutes.
All right. That's good. That's good to know. I mean, that's an interesting path. And so is that kind of the path that led you to get connected with this project and with Josie? Like, was it through the sustainability side or through the music side or both? I'm curious about that.
Music is just this magical opportunity and I guess process that brings people together. So often you'd be working with someone in the same building, but then you'd end up seeing them at an open mic or an open jam. And that's how I ended up meeting Josie. We realized we work on similar things. We did the same masters. And so music actually brought us together. And then I got introduced better to her work. And we, over a few years, we discussed different opportunities to collaborate until those opportunities managed to manifest. So I think definitely one of the gifts of music, and music is the gift that keeps on giving, in the sense that it keeps connecting me to wonderful people, even in my field of work.
Okay, interesting. It's I love that idea of a connection and community is sort of built into music, and I think feeling as well. And that was one of the things I wanted to ask you about, because one of the things I found most interesting about the performance, I mean, there was a lot of interesting things, but one of the most interesting was this kind of thread of feeling that went through the whole thing. So like at the beginning of the performance, you asked the audience, how are you feeling? You asked them that again at the end. You also mentioned feeling or needing to bring feelings in or something in the middle. So I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about how you see this idea of feeling and music and sustainability fitting together? That, I mean, obviously music and feeling are deeply connected, but is there a route to connecting that into sustainability as well?
Absolutely. Sustainability as a field is kind of a strange one, because it's one that has come in response to, I guess, feelings of fear of what is to come next, fear of whether or not we can continue being safe going into the future. So there's a lot, it's a very emotional process, yet the way lots of us are engaging with it professionally or technically, academically, or even philosophically sometimes detaches our minds or the cognitive process from the emotional one. And so I think what's been a blessing of having music constantly in my life, making music in my life, is that in the end something will either resonate, something sounds good, I guess, through one's emotions. It's a constant reminder to check in with one's feelings and how see that works. So I think learning from bringing the musical process and the musical process of engaging with emotions and bringing that to my day-to-day work is very rewarding on many different levels, but especially even professionally, to remember that this is an emotional process. We are engaging with people who are inherently emotional, and so music has allowed me to continue making those links as necessary.
Okay, so that's a lot of, you see that idea of feeling and the power of that personally and professionally, and is that something you think also can be like extended out to audiences? Like, for example, like at IST, that audience was made up of sustainability professionals and academic researchers. And as we've talked about before, feeling is not necessarily respected in academia, but which seems odd considering in the rest of humanity it is. So do you think there's kind of opportunities to kind of get into sustainability, either professional audiences or general audiences in a different way, or a different way that sustainability communication usually works?
So we often discuss emotions in the context of communications for sustainability, but especially when we're communicating with wider audiences, when we want to, quote unquote, raise awareness, or when we want to engage in advocacy. There we take into account people's emotions and how the tone we use and the words that we use matter. But we often don't necessarily think the same with those who are actually working in the field of sustainability, whether academics or practitioners or even decision makers. And I feel that there's a lot of room to engage with the emotions of colleagues who are working in the field, to ensure that we make room for these emotions, we make a safer space to acknowledge the existence of these emotions and the role of these emotions in guiding how we think and how we act and what we base our decisions and our ideologies on, even.
That's very interesting. And it's actually a great segue into another question I wanted to ask you. You talked about the musical process, and you talked about sort of potentially triggering emotions. And I remember doing our sort of rehearsals and composition process. We ended up talking a lot about this idea of disruption and disturbance and having some different interventions in the piece. And we also talked about disrupting conventions of scale and keys and so on. And I'm curious your thoughts on how that ended up in the performance, and did that kind of have the effect that we were looking for? Because it's actually, as you mentioned, like, it's, people often have this idea of fear, and you don't want to necessarily trigger fear, but at the same time, we do want to disrupt conventions. I'm kind of curious your thoughts on how we were thinking about that and how that ended up in the performance.
A great way often to start when establishing any type of connection, whether through language or through music, is establishing some type of common ground. And I feel through the musical process, when you want to establish a common ground, you discuss things like rhythm, like beat. You discuss the scale. What is the common scale that we can work with? You build that common ground or that common foundation, and then And then you can get weird. You can start integrating novelty. You can start exploring different types of emotions. And so using that process or that flow, I think we asked ourselves, what do we want people to feel? How are we feeling? And how do we want to engage with people's feelings in that process? And then making sure that the musical journey links well with the intellectual or the cognitive journey, and making those mesh well together is a part of that artistic process or that musical process. And I think that's what we try to do, both creating an overarching framework, a flow or a storyline of where we want to go, and then making room for a lot of flexibility to meander in between those different stages, and to introduce surprises and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's fascinating hearing you talk about that, because I talked when I was talking with Josie and Dan, and we've talked about this as well. This idea of the storytelling and what we want people to feel, and also a bit of this tension that I certainly felt of how much are we actually guiding people down a path versus how much are we letting people find their own path? How much are we telling people what to feel versus letting them feel? And I think that's always an interesting tension as an artist, where as soon as it comes out of your mouth or you're on stage, in a certain way you're in control, but you also lose control. As soon as those sound waves come out of the speakers, you don't know how the audience is going to react. So it's an interesting dynamic there.
Absolutely, and not to get too philosophical here, but I think there's two key words that I guess I want to introduce here, and that's questions and grooves. And so what does a question have in common with a groove? They say that groove, or something that's dancey, it's not the notes that you play, but it's the spaces between them. And so it's about the space that you create between them. And similarly with questions, when you ask a question, you create a space for someone's mind to fill it with whatever the question itself triggers. So you can ask a provocative question, but it's still a question that gives someone the agency or the opportunity to allow their minds to flow in one way or another. And same thing with the groove. You can give someone a beat, and then people's bodies will move or engage with that beat or with the spaces in between them in different ways. Again, slightly potentially philosophical and super meta, but it's that I guess fine line between guiding someone somewhere and then creating a space for someone to find themselves and to feel their feelings in that space.
Excellent. Great. Yeah, I just making mental notes to myself to think about swing and groove for my next performance. Awesome. Well, thanks very much for taking the time to chat. I really appreciate that. And I'll let you get off to some music for this evening.
Thank you for the space.
You're welcome. Thanks, Noor.
Take care, dude. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right, we've heard some bits and pieces of the performance. We've heard discussion about how it came together, what we were trying to do. So here's the full recording so you can hear how it all came together.
How are you feeling? Appropriately caffeinated, I hope. So before we begin, I'd like to manage each other's expectations, and we'll walk you through 3 scenarios. The first scenario, imagine at the end of this performance, you love it with every fiber of your being. So you want to practice a huge round of applause when we count you in. So on the count of 3, IST, 1, 2, 3. Did we capture that, Drew's noise? Fantastic. Scenario 2. You absolutely hate it. It's horrendous. It's weird. You don't get it. So you hate it with every bit of you. So on the count of 3, when we count you in, we want you to boo, the loudest boo that this hall has ever heard. So on the count of 3, IST, 1, 2, 3. Frightening. The third scenario, and this is probably the worst case scenario, is that you feel absolutely nothing. Nothing at all. No emotions. You're left with an awkward, weird feeling at the end. So we'll ask you, when we count you in, for an awkward silence, and we mean it. Dead silence. On the count of 3, IST. 1, 2, 3. You guys are great at following orders, which is great for us, maybe not so great for sustainability transitions, but we have 3 days to discuss that in detail. Thank you. Josie, over to you.
All sounds you're about to hear will be created live right here. Doom, 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 doom. 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 Doom, 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 doom. Doom, 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 doom,
So not to state the obvious, but we've been singing to Doom for the last few minutes. Some of us may have enjoyed it, and there's no shame in enjoying Doom. But conveniently, Doom, spelled backwards, is mood. So I'd like to ask you again, how's your mood? And how are we actually feeling? So we'd like to get a little bit of heart in our performance. We'd like to invite a volunteer from the audience who will come join us and volunteer his heartbeat. So can we please give Joost a warm round of applause.
looked at all 458 accepted abstracts. Some words appeared many, many times, many you'd expect. Transitions, sustainability, research, policy, energy. But some words only appeared once or twice across all abstracts. So we thought it'd be intriguing to force ourselves to only use those words for the rest of the song.
feeling.
Okay, thanks for listening to Sustain first episode. Hope to catch you again next time. Be sure to sign up for our email list on our website, sustain.fm. Follow our Instagram, also sustain.fm. You get more info on the radio show, in-person events in different cities, live streams, and more. All right, until next time, see you on the dance floor.